The lighthouse had stood on the edge of the cliff for over a century, its light slicing through the thick ocean mist like a spectral eye that never blinked. Some said it was cursed. Others said it was simply forgotten by time. Yet for Elias Harrow, the old structure represented something else entirely, an opportunity. When he received the letter inviting him to be its new caretaker, he didn't hesitate. The job was simple: keep the lantern burning, monitor the tides, and record any unusual occurrences. He assumed the last instruction was a relic of old superstition, something the previous keepers had entertained out of boredom. His arrival at the lighthouse was uneventful. The village that lay miles inland was small, and few people there even spoke of the lighthouse, as though it were an unpleasant memory. The only man who acknowledged Elias's destination was an old fisherman who ferried him to the cliffside path, his silence punctuated only by the rhythmic creak of the oars. "Been abandoned a long time," the fisherman muttered as he tied the boat to a jagged rock. "Strange place. You got someone coming for you?" Elias shook his head. The old man said nothing more, but his gaze lingered on Elias as he climbed the steep trail toward the tower. The lighthouse was larger than he had imagined, with its whitewashed stone worn gray by centuries of storms. The entrance groaned as he forced it open, the air inside thick with salt and something faintly metallic. Dust clung to every surface, and the scent of decay lingered in the narrow corridors. The living quarters were sparse: a cot, a desk, and a small wood-burning stove. On the far wall hung a single, warped mirror, its surface distorted like water in a restless tide. Elias didn't like looking at it. He found the logbook on the desk, its leather cover cracked with age. The last entry was dated 20 years prior, written in the jagged scrawl of someone who had been in a hurry. "Light must never go out. It is watching. It is waiting." Elias frowned, but dismissed the note as the ramblings of an isolated mind. He turned the page, but the rest of the journal was blank. Outside, the ocean stretched infinitely in all directions, its waves pounding the rocks below like the slow ticking of a great, unseen clock. The wind howled through the narrow windows, rattling the shutters as though something wanted in. Despite the emptiness of the place, Elias couldn't shake the sensation that he was not alone. It was absurd, of course, just the tricks of an overactive imagination. He forced himself to focus on his tasks, ascending the spiral staircase to the lantern room. The light mechanism was old but intact, its brass fittings dulled by neglect. He cranked the handle, feeling the weight of years pressing against his efforts. With a low, shuddering hum, the beacon flickered to life, its beams slicing through the night. The moment the light reached full brightness, Elias heard it. Footsteps, soft and deliberate, echoing from the stairs below. He froze, heart pounding in his throat. The lighthouse had been abandoned for decades. No one should be here. He called out, his voice swallowed by the vast emptiness of the tower. No answer. The footsteps stopped. Swallowing hard, he descended the stairs cautiously, gripping the iron railing for support. The air grew colder with each step, and when he reached the bottom, he found nothing but silence. The door remained bolted shut. The only sign of life was the reflection in the old mirror, which for a brief moment showed not one figure, but two. Elias turned sharply, but the room was empty. His breath came in uneven gasps. He tried to rationalize it, perhaps a trick of the light, the exhaustion from travel. Yet, deep in his bones, he felt something had shifted the moment he lit the beacon. He was no longer alone in the lighthouse, and whatever had been waiting in the darkness was now awake. Elias spent the first night in the lighthouse without sleep. The rhythmic sweep of the beacon illuminated the room in intervals, casting shifting shadows across the walls. No matter how he positioned himself on the cot, he could not shake the sensation of being watched. The mirror across the room, warped and dust-covered, seemed to reflect something more than just his weary face. Every time he glanced at it, he half expected to see movement behind him. He resisted the urge to turn it toward the wall, unwilling to acknowledge the growing unease settling in his chest. By morning, exhaustion weighed heavily on him, but he forced himself to begin his duties. He ventured outside, standing at the edge of the cliff where the jagged rocks loomed below. The waves crashed violently, sending a salty mist into the air. The wind howled through the emptiness. Yet beneath it, Elias thought he heard something else, a low, humming sound, almost like a voice. He turned sharply, scanning the landscape, but he was alone. Inside, he explored more thoroughly. The lighthouse had a small storeroom filled with rusted tools, oil drums, and remnants of past keepers' belongings. Dust-covered books sat on a wooden shelf, their pages yellowed with age. One, a worn journal with a leather strap, caught his attention. He untied it, flipping through brittle pages filled with the scrawled handwriting of someone long gone. The entries started as routine logs, documenting the tides and weather patterns. But as he read further, the notes grew erratic. The light must never go out. The moment it faltered, the whispering began. Something moves in the fog at night. It watches from below. I see its shadow in the water, but it is never there when I look directly. Elias closed the book, his pulse quickening. He told himself it was the paranoia of a man who had spent too much time in isolation. And yet, the words burrowed into his mind, refusing to be dismissed. He made his way back up the spiral staircase to the lantern room, where the great brass light continued its tireless rotation. He placed a hand against the warm metal, reassured by its steady presence. That night, as the beacon cut through the thickening fog, Elias remained alert. He sat at the base of the stairs, listening. At first, there was nothing but the usual sounds, the wind against the stone, the waves below. Then, a noise unlike any other reached his ears, a faint tapping, like fingers drumming against glass. He turned his gaze upward to the lantern room. The sound came again, soft, deliberate. A rational part of his mind told him it was the wind, that the glass dome housing the beacon had expanded with the heat. But the tapping continued, rhythmic and insistent, as if something or someone was trying to get in. Slowly, Elias ascended the staircase, each step echoing into the empty space. The tapping ceased the moment he reached the top. The lantern room was as it had been, empty, the great light spinning in its eternal cycle. He exhaled, forcing out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He turned to leave, and then, in the reflection of the glass, he saw it. A figure stood outside, pressed against the dome, its face obscured by the glare of the beacon. Elias whipped around, but there was nothing beyond the glass but open sky and swirling mist. His heart pounded in his chest as he staggered back. He knew what he had seen. Something was out there, and it had found him. Elias remained frozen in the lantern room, his breath shallow, eyes locked on the glass dome. He scanned the swirling mist outside, looking for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, just the endless fog rolling over the cliffside, illuminated by the lighthouse's sweeping beam. Yet, he knew what he had seen, a figure, pressed against the glass. Watching him, his rational mind struggled for explanations. A trick of the light? His own reflection distorted by exhaustion? But the chill in his bones told him otherwise. Something had been there, and something had left before he could confront it. The idea unsettled him more than the sight itself. For the rest of the night, Elias sat at the base of the lantern, unwilling to return to his quarters. He kept the light running, checking every few minutes to ensure it hadn't faltered. He thought about the journal he had found, the strange warnings left by the previous keepers. The light must never go out. The words clawed at the back of his mind. As dawn crept over the horizon, the fog began to retreat, and with it, the eerie silence that had settled over the lighthouse. The waves became audible again. The wind lost its oppressive weight. It was as if the night had released him from its grasp, allowing the world to return to normal. But Elias felt no relief. Determined to shake the unease, he spent the morning examining the lighthouse's perimeter. The cliffside was steep, making it nearly impossible for anyone, or anything, to have climbed up to the glass dome outside the lantern room. He checked the lighthouse door, confirming it was still bolted from the inside. No footprints in the damp earth. No sign that anyone had been there. And yet he couldn't erase the image from his mind. As the day wore on, Elias decided to head down to the shore below. A narrow, winding path led from the lighthouse to the rocky beach, where shipwrecks had met their fate for centuries. He needed to feel the ground beneath his feet, to remind himself that he wasn't losing his grip on reality. But as he descended, the uneasy feeling returned. The air was too still, the ocean too quiet. The waves lapped at the rocks sluggishly, as though waiting. Something glinted in the shallows, a fragment of metal, half buried in the sand. As Elias knelt to examine it, he realized it was a rusted nameplate, the letters barely legible beneath the corrosion. He wiped away the grime and felt his stomach tighten. The plate belonged to the last recorded shipwreck near the lighthouse, the Argos, a vessel lost at sea 2 decades ago. A shipwreck was not unusual, given the treacherous waters surrounding the cliffside. But what sent a shiver down his spine was what he found next. Just beyond the nameplate, in the wet sand, were footprints. Barefoot, deep, leading from the water's edge toward the cliff path. Elias turned sharply, scanning the beach. The footprints were fresh, but the shore was empty. Heart pounding, he followed the prints back toward the base of the lighthouse. They led to the very bottom of the stone steps, and then stopped, as if whoever or whatever had made them had simply vanished. A gust of wind swept over him, carrying with it a whispering sound. Not words, but something close. A hum, low and deliberate, like the groaning of the tide against the rocks. Elias took a step back, suddenly aware of how exposed he was. The sun was beginning to sink, and the mist was creeping in once more. He knew he couldn't stay outside after dark. Not after what he had seen. Not after what he had found. As he climbed the steps back into the lighthouse, Elias forced himself not to look over his shoulder. He didn't need to. He already knew he wasn't alone. Elias bolted the lighthouse door behind him, the heavy iron latch echoing in the empty space. He pressed his back against the cold wooden surface, breath unsteady. The footprints had stopped at the base of the lighthouse, gone, as if their owner had evaporated into thin air. But Elias knew better. Someone or something had walked up from the sea, and now was inside the fog watching. He shook off the thought and forced himself to move. The journal. He needed to check the journal again. Maybe the previous keeper had seen the same things, felt the same creeping dread that now clung to him. He retrieved the leather-bound book from the shelf, flipping through the brittle pages, eyes scanning for something, anything, that could explain what was happening. I see its shadow in the water. It mimics my movements in the glass, but it is not me. Elias's stomach tightened. The entry was from years ago, written in frantic, slanted handwriting. He turned the page, only to find several lines furiously scratched out. The next legible sentence sent a chill through his spine. If I look too long, it will step forward. He closed the journal with a sharp snap and ran a hand through his hair. Was he losing his mind? Was isolation already affecting him? He needed to shake off the paranoia. He needed something solid, something real. Making his way to the lantern room, Elias climbed the spiraling staircase, the metal steps creaking beneath his weight. The lighthouse's great brass lens rotated with its steady rhythm, casting its powerful beam over the cliffside and ocean. He placed his hands on the railing and exhaled, letting the repetition of the light calm his thoughts. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. The reflection in the glass. It was him, his own face staring back. But something was wrong. His reflection stood too still, too rigid, as if waiting. Elias swallowed, lifting his hand slightly to test his fear. His reflection did the same. He exhaled in relief. He was imagining things, but then his reflection's fingers curled just a second too late. Elias recoiled, stumbling backward, knocking over a stool. His breath came in sharp gasps as he stared at the glass. The reflection still mimicked him, but he knew what he had seen. The delay, the hesitation, like something was studying him, figuring out how to copy him correctly. The journal's warning rang in his head. If I look too long, it will step forward. He spun on his heels and ran down the stairs, taking them 2 at a time, nearly tripping in his haste. His own shadow stretched against the wall, twisting in the lantern's glow. He reached the bottom and gripped the railing, forcing himself to stop, to breathe. Silence. The mirror in his quarters. He had to cover it. Elias grabbed the sheet from his cot and draped it over the warped glass, his hands shaking. He couldn't let it watch him. He couldn't let it learn. As he stepped back, something tapped against the lighthouse window. A soft, deliberate sound. Tap, tap, tap. It was inside the fog, and it wanted to come closer. The tapping continued, slow, deliberate, like the measured knock of someone too patient, too certain that they would be let in. Elias stood frozen in his quarters, his breath caught in his throat. The window rattled slightly as the wind shifted outside, but the tapping persisted, unaffected by the gusts. He forced himself to move, inching toward the window with careful steps. The lighthouse's beam swung across the fog, casting long shadows that flickered and distorted. Then the light passed over the window, and he saw it, a face, his own face, staring in from the other side of the glass. Elias staggered backward, his heartbeat slamming against his ribs. The thing outside had his features, his eyes, his mouth, his unshaven jaw. But there was something hollow about it, something stretched and wrong, like a mask pulled too tight over a shape that did not quite fit. It did not blink. It did not breathe. It only smiled. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to move. The figure outside lifted its hand and knocked again. 3 slow, deliberate taps, fingers pressing lightly against the glass. Then it spoke. "Let me in," Elias gasped. The voice was his, but the tone was not. It was too smooth, too perfectly modulated, like someone repeating a phrase they had just learned. His mind reeled. This could not be happening. He had to be dreaming, some terrible, fevered hallucination brought on by isolation. But then the thing outside pressed its palm flat against the glass, and the light from the lighthouse beam illuminated it fully. The hand had too many fingers. Elias turned and ran. He tore through the lighthouse corridors, his footsteps echoing violently against the stone walls. The journal. He needed the journal. He needed to know what the last keeper had written about this, what they had done to survive. He sprinted to the main hall, nearly tripping over a loose floorboard, and grabbed the journal with shaking hands. Flipping frantically through the pages, he found another entry, written in the same frantic scrawl. "It learns. It mimics. Do not let it inside." Elias slammed the book shut. He didn't need the warning. He would never open that door. Never. But then, a voice called out from the hallway behind him. Elias. It was his own voice. Slowly, unwillingly, he turned. At the end of the darkened corridor, standing in the open doorway of the lantern room, was himself. Or rather, the thing that wore his face. It stood impossibly still, head tilted slightly, studying him. Its eyes gleamed, reflecting the light in an unnatural way. Then ever so slowly, it took a step forward. Elias backed away. His mind raced, trying to find an escape, trying to think of anything other than the horrifying realization sinking into his chest. The thing had been outside, but now it was in. Elias's breath came in ragged gasps as he pressed himself against the far wall. The figure standing in the lantern room doorway did not move, but he could feel it watching him, measuring him. It had his shape, his posture, even the subtle way his fingers twitched when he was nervous. But its eyes were wrong. They were too still, too unblinking, like glass marbles set into his own face. The silence between them stretched, thick and suffocating. Then, as if rehearsed, the figure took a single step forward. Elias mirrored the movement in retreat, his back nearly hitting the bookshelf. He needed to get out of the lighthouse, out of the nightmare that was unfolding around him. But to do that, he would have to pass the thing that wore his face. It spoke. "You're tired, Elias." Hearing his own voice come from something else sent a visceral wave of nausea through his body. The cadence was identical, but there was no warmth, no inflection, just the perfect imitation of human speech, hollow and lifeless. Elias shook his head, gripping the edge of the desk to steady himself. "You're not real," he whispered, though the words felt meaningless even as they left his lips. The thing tilted its head, a perfect mirror of Elias's own confused expressions. It took another step forward, slow and deliberate. "I am," it said. Elias clenched his fists. His mind screamed at him to act, to run, to fight. But fight what? A reflection? A shadow? If he attacked it, would he be hitting himself? The thought made him dizzy. Then the lighthouse beam swung around, and for a brief moment, the light fell fully upon the figure. And Elias saw it, really saw it. It had his face, his body, his clothes, but where the light touched its exposed skin, there was something underneath. A shimmer, like a second layer writhing beneath its surface, pressing outward. Its fingers twitched unnaturally, and Elias noticed that when it moved, there was the faintest lag, a fraction of a second where its body seemed to remember how to copy him. It was still learning. Elias bolted. He didn't think, didn't hesitate. He lunged toward the staircase, feet pounding against the steps as he took them 3 at a time. The lighthouse shook with the wind outside, the old structure groaning as if straining against some unseen force. He reached the top, nearly collapsing against the railing of the lantern room. Below him, the thing followed, but it didn't run. It walked slowly, steadily, like it knew he had nowhere to go. Elias's eyes darted to the massive brass lantern. The flame inside flickered wildly against the glass. His mind raced. Fire. The thing had skin like his, but was it flesh? Did it burn? He had to find out. But before he could act, a voice whispered from below. "You're going to have to sleep eventually, Elias." And then it smiled. Elias clutched the railing of the lantern room, his knuckles turning white as his mind reeled. The thing was still coming, climbing the stairs with unnatural patience, its movements deliberate and smooth, like a predator toying with prey. The wind howled through the lighthouse, rattling the glass, but the only sound Elias truly heard was the rhythmic creak of the steps beneath his own feet, and the thing that wore his face. His thoughts spiraled. If it was learning, if it was adapting, then what would happen when it understood him completely? Would it replace him? Erase him? He had no idea what it wanted, only that it moved with certainty, with purpose. The flame inside the great lantern flickered madly as another strong gust battered the tower. Elias glanced at it, his mind scrambling for ideas. The lighthouse beacon was built to withstand storms, built to guide ships in the worst of conditions. But the thing following him, was it built to withstand fire? The steps creaked again. Elias turned back, and for a moment, he swore it had grown closer without taking a step. The illusion made his skin crawl. "I don't need to sleep," he forced himself to say, testing the thing's reaction. His voice was hoarse but steady. "But I don't think you know what pain feels like." It stopped, just for a fraction of a second. But that was all Elias needed. He lunged toward the lantern, gripping the edge of the brass housing. The heat radiated through his fingers as he grabbed hold of the protective glass casing. With a grunt, he pulled, yanking at the mechanism meant to keep it sealed from the elements. The wind shrieked as the casing came loose, exposing the flame inside. The thing with his face tilted its head, watching him, studying. Elias didn't hesitate. He grabbed the lantern's heavy oil canister, its cap worn and rusted from years of storms. He turned back toward the stairs, toward the thing, and in one desperate motion, he flung the oil downward. It splashed against the wooden steps, against the thing's feet, against its skin. The thing hesitated again. Its glassy eyes flickered toward the spreading pool of oil, then back up to Elias. And then it smiled. Elias's stomach lurched. The expression was wrong, stretched too wide, the teeth too perfect, too uniform. It was mimicking, yes, but now it was playing with him. It wasn't afraid. It was amused. A scream built in Elias's throat, but he didn't give himself time to think. He grabbed the lantern's metal poker, thrust it into the open flame, and watched as the tip ignited. The fire danced along the metal, casting long, violent shadows against the walls. Then he threw it. The moment the flame touched the oil, the staircase erupted in fire. The wooden steps went up instantly, an inferno raging between him and the thing. Smoke curled in thick, black plumes, filling the tower with a choking haze. Elias staggered back, coughing, his eyes stinging. He couldn't see the thing anymore, couldn't hear its footsteps. Had it burned? Had he won? His lungs ached, and his vision blurred as the smoke thickened. He had to get out. If the fire spread, the entire lighthouse would go up and he would be trapped. Stumbling toward the maintenance hatch that led to the outside balcony, he fumbled with the latch, desperate for air. Then, just as he shoved the door open, a voice spoke from behind him. A perfect, untouched voice. "You burned the wrong one, Elias." And then, from the shadows of the smoke, something stepped forward, something wearing his face. The cold night air hit Elias like a wave as he stumbled onto the lighthouse balcony, coughing against the thick smoke curling from inside. His lungs burned, his vision swam, but his mind latched onto one undeniable fact. The thing was still here. The fire hadn't stopped it. It hadn't even slowed it down. He gripped the railing, forcing himself to steady his breath, his thoughts. Below, the sea crashed violently against the jagged rocks, the waves reflecting the chaotic glow of the fire, now consuming the staircase. The wooden beams groaned beneath the strain, and Elias knew that soon the entire structure would be at risk. But that didn't matter if he couldn't escape the thing that hunted him. Behind him, the doorway to the lantern room remained open, thick smoke pouring through like a living thing. Elias turned back, half expecting to see the figure emerge from the haze, untouched by the flames. But there was nothing. No movement, no sound. And then something shifted. It wasn't a noise, not exactly. It was a presence, a wrongness in the air that made the hairs on the back of Elias's neck rise. He squinted into the smoke, his pulse hammering against his ribs. A shape moved just beyond the doorway. Elias took a step back, his grip tightening on the railing. His own voice echoed from the smoke, soft, patient. "You don't trust what you see, Elias." "That's good. That means you're learning." His breath hitched. It wasn't just mimicking him anymore. It was thinking, adapting. "I don't need to trust what I see," Elias called back, forcing confidence into his voice. "I just need to stop you." The thing laughed. A perfect, chilling echo of Elias's own nervous chuckle. "Stop what exactly?" it asked. The smoke thinned slightly, and Elias saw something that made his stomach drop. The fire had consumed the stairs, but the floorboards where the thing stood were untouched. The flame should have spread, should have burned everything. And yet, there it was standing in the same place, unharmed. He had burned the wrong one. Elias's breath quickened. What if the lighthouse itself was lying to him? The fire, the shadows, the thing that mimicked him. What if none of it followed the rules he understood? His grip on reality was slipping, warping, bending to something else's design. He had to move. Spinning on his heels, he ran along the narrow balcony, his boots slipping against the damp stone. The only way down was the emergency ladder bolted to the side of the lighthouse. He reached the edge, heart pounding, and swung one leg over, gripping the cold metal rungs. The wind howled around him, threatening to rip him from the structure entirely. He risked a glance upward. The thing stood on the balcony now, watching him. It wasn't moving. It didn't need to, because as Elias descended, he realized something that turned his blood to ice. The waves below weren't crashing against the rocks anymore. They weren't moving at all. The ocean, the storm, the entire world beyond the lighthouse had gone completely still. Elias's feet hit the ground with a soft thud as he reached the base of the lighthouse, his heart still hammering in his chest. He stumbled away from the ladder, glancing around. The moonlight cast an eerie glow over the rocky shore, and the world felt unnaturally still. The wind that had previously battered the lighthouse had all but vanished, leaving only a heavy silence. The sea, which had once been in a state of constant, restless motion, now appeared as a perfect mirror, frozen in time. The waves were still. This was wrong. Elias's pulse quickened, and his mind raced. The stillness of the ocean was unnatural. It wasn't just the absence of sound, but the complete lack of movement. The tide should have been rising or falling. The waves should have been crashing, yet there was nothing. He was standing at the edge of a lake of glass, an impossible stillness that defied everything he knew about the world. He turned back to the lighthouse, instinct telling him to retreat, to find safety. But as he glanced up, the windows at the top of the tower seemed to flicker, like something had shifted in the light. The reflection of the flame inside danced briefly against the darkness, then disappeared. He froze. It had been a moment of desperation, a reflexive choice driven by fear. But now Elias realized something even worse. The thing was inside the lighthouse. Not just mimicking his movements, not just copying him. It was alive in a way he had not yet understood. It had claimed the structure as its own, controlling everything within it. And now it was spreading beyond. The lighthouse was no longer a beacon. It was a trap. Elias's gaze snapped back to the ocean. There, just beyond the still waters, a ripple began to form. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, but it was growing, spreading outward, as if something vast and unseen was stirring beneath the glassy surface. His instinct screamed at him to run, to get away from the water, but he couldn't take his eyes off the anomaly. The ripple began to undulate, growing larger and more chaotic, as though the entire ocean was being tugged by invisible hands. The stillness, that terrifying silence, shattered in an instant. The waves began to crash, not in their natural rhythm, but in violent, unnatural surges. A sound like a low, gurgling roar rose from the depths, vibrating through the air, almost like the ocean itself was alive. The waves rolled higher, faster, their crests sharp and dangerous, crashing violently against the shore. Yet, despite the chaos of the water, Elias could still hear it, the silence in the lighthouse above. Suddenly, the earth beneath him trembled. The rocks shifted, the ground groaning as if something immense was rising from below, just beneath the surface of the water. Elias's heart skipped a beat, his eyes wide as he realized the true horror of the situation. The thing had not just learned from him, it had mastered him. It was no longer confined to the lighthouse. It had taken the ocean itself. The tide rose impossibly high, the water crashing against the cliffs like a great beast reaching for the sky. Elias staggered back, stumbling as the ground beneath him shifted again, as though the very earth were being pulled by some unseen force. His mind reeled. Nothing about this made sense. How had the thing learned to control the sea? How had it crossed the threshold of the lighthouse? In a desperate moment of clarity, Elias understood what was happening. The lighthouse was not just a building. It was a conduit, a vessel through which something ancient and powerful could seep into the world. The thing had found a way to break free of the lighthouse's constraints. It was no longer just imitating him. It had become him, and it had taken everything it could. It had taken the ocean, the sky, and now it was taking the land. The sound of cracking stone echoed in the air as the ground around him began to buckle and break apart. The water surged forward, pushing against the cliffs, threatening to swallow him whole. He turned and ran, but the landscape had changed. The familiar path to the town, the route he had used countless times, was gone. There was only the dark expanse of the ocean, swallowing everything in its path. The lighthouse stood tall behind him, its windows still flickering with the flame's reflection, now more like a mirage than a real light. It was a beacon of something far more terrible than anything Elias had ever known. Something had been unleashed, and there was no escaping it now. The ground was giving way beneath Elias's feet as he ran, the rocks and earth beneath him crumbling like paper. He knew that he couldn't outrun the flood. It wasn't just the ocean rising behind him. No, this was something worse, something far more insidious. The thing had begun to warp the very fabric of his reality. The landscape had stopped obeying the natural laws Elias had known. The rocks shifted and twisted as if the land itself were being shaped by a hand unseen. He pushed himself harder, his breath ragged in his chest. There was no escape, no clear path forward. His mind raced. The town, the people, the lighthouse. He had to get back to the town, warn them. But the path, which had once been so familiar, was disappearing, swallowed by the monstrous waves now crashing against the cliffs. The very ground was pulling back, sinking into the sea. Elias paused for a moment, looking over his shoulder. The lighthouse stood like a dark silhouette against the swirling chaos of the ocean. Its light, once a beacon to guide ships through the storm, now pulsed ominously, as though it were watching him. It was no longer a symbol of hope. It had become something much darker. The ocean, too, had become an extension of that darkness. It wasn't simply the water that was rising. It was as if the ocean itself were alive, its waves towering unnaturally high, each one slamming into the cliffside with a force that made the earth tremble. But it wasn't the waves that unsettled Elias the most. It was the unnatural stillness that had settled within the waves, a quiet, palpable dread that gripped his chest. And then, the wind changed direction. It wasn't a gust or a breeze, but a violent shift, as if something immense had turned and begun to move. The air tasted of salt, of decay, of something forgotten, something ancient. Elias's stomach twisted in response. The world was falling apart, and he was standing in the center of it. A faint glow appeared on the horizon. At first, Elias thought it was just the distant reflection of the lighthouse light, but as he squinted against the darkness, he realized it was something else. A thick, unnatural light stretching across the sky, like the horizon itself was splitting open. His mind raced, trying to grasp the enormity of what he was seeing. It was a rupture in the sky, an opening, and through it, Elias thought he saw something moving. There was no way to describe it, but the sensation of wrongness flooded over him. It was as if something had crossed over from another realm, a thing from beyond the horizon, and it was now reaching down into the world he knew. His heart pounded in his chest as the rupture in the sky grew wider, the light growing in intensity, no longer like the reflection of the lighthouse, but something raw, primal. The ocean seemed to quiet as it too turned its attention to the rift above, the waves now still, almost as if awaiting some unseen command. Elias wanted to run. He wanted to escape, to find safety. But where could he go? The land was disappearing beneath him. The very earth he stood on was being consumed by the rift, sinking into the abyss. The sky above had split open, revealing something far darker and more ancient than anything his mind could comprehend. It was as if the lighthouse had been a prison, no, a gate, holding something at bay, but now that gate was wide open, and Elias was standing in the heart of it. He turned toward the lighthouse again, but this time, it felt different. The structure loomed in the distance, the light now flickering, uncertain. It was no longer a refuge. The thing had claimed it as its own. The flames flickered and died out, the structure now a hollow shell, a monument to something malevolent that had been unleashed. It wasn't just a lighthouse. It was a signal, a beacon not for ships, but for something far worse. And then Elias understood with chilling clarity. The lighthouse had never been a protector. It had been the key to unlocking whatever dark force had slumbered beneath the waves, beneath the very land. And now that key had been turned. The horizon was opening, and there was no going back. As the ocean finally began to roar again, louder than before, the ground beneath Elias's feet buckled. It was too late to run, too late to fight. The thing had broken free. Elias stood frozen, unable to move, paralyzed by the vast, encroaching darkness that was swallowing the horizon. The sky was no longer a sky, but an abyss, a swirling black void that seemed to pull at his very soul. The rift above him had widened, stretching into an endless expanse of night. A faint hum filled the air, resonating from the depths of the ocean, reverberating through the ground beneath his feet. The waves, once violent and crashing, now surged with an unnatural rhythm, as though they too were being drawn into the rift. The land trembled once more, this time with greater intensity. It was as if the world itself was being unraveled, the ground shaking under the weight of a presence that defied the natural order. Elias could feel the pressure building, the air thickening with a sense of impending doom. His heart raced, but his limbs felt heavy, unwilling to respond. It was as if the force from the horizon was tugging at his very will, pulling him closer to the edge of the abyss. He had to move. He had to run. But the path that had once led to the safety of the town was gone. The familiar coastline was now a jagged, unstable cliff, the rocks crumbling into the dark waters below. There was nowhere to go. The world had collapsed into a nightmare, and Elias was trapped in the heart of it. The hum from the rift grew louder, more pronounced. It was no longer just a sound, but a physical presence, vibrating through his body, making his bones ache. As if summoned by the dark energy that filled the air, the ocean began to churn violently once more, its waves crashing with a frenzy that seemed both desperate and determined. The water, no longer merely a force of nature, had become something else entirely. Something alive, something that knew what was coming. Elias's mind raced, desperately searching for any shred of logic, any explanation. But there was none. The thing in the lighthouse, the rift in the sky, the ocean, the boundaries between them had all dissolved. There was no longer a distinction between the land and the sea, between the world of men and the horrors that lay beyond. It was all one now, all part of the same dark, suffocating force. The barrier had been shattered, and something ancient and terrible was pouring through. A shape began to emerge from the water, rising slowly, impossibly. Elias's breath caught in his throat as he watched, transfixed by the impossible sight. The waves receded momentarily, as if parting for something that should never have been. The shape was massive, like the silhouette of a great beast emerging from the depths, its form indistinct but horrifying in its enormity. It was then that Elias understood the true nature of the rift. It was not a tear in the sky, nor merely a portal. It was a conduit, a bridge between the realms, and whatever had been summoned through that bridge was not meant to be seen, not meant to exist in the world of the living. It was an ancient being, a force that had long been buried, sealed away beneath the waves. But now it had been awakened. The ground beneath Elias's feet shifted again, but this time it was different. The earth cracked and splintered, as though the very core of the world was being torn apart. The wind, which had been still for so long, began to whip violently around him, carrying with it a thick, salty mist that stung his eyes. The air was heavy, saturated with something dark and oppressive. Elias could feel it in his chest, in his lungs, suffocating him. He stumbled back, but it was no use. The darkness was closing in, filling every corner of the landscape, every crack in the earth. There was nowhere left to hide. The rift above, now fully open, seemed to pulse with an ominous energy, drawing everything toward it. The ocean surged forward once more, its waves crashing violently against the cliffs, as though the sea itself were rebelling against the intrusion of the darkness. But it was too late. The rift had already consumed everything. Elias's vision blurred, his head spinning as the world around him began to fold in on itself. He could feel the pull of the rift, the way it tugged at the very essence of his being. It wasn't just the land that was being consumed, it was everything. The sky, the sea, the earth. Everything was being drawn into the abyss, swallowed whole by the darkness. And there was no escaping it. As Elias's legs gave way beneath him, he fell to his knees, his eyes fixed on the enormous form rising from the ocean. It was too late. The world was dying, and there was nothing left to do but watch as the dark tide consumed everything. The world had become a vortex, spinning in slow, torturous cycles as Elias struggled to regain his bearings. His body felt like lead, heavy and unresponsive. The vast, dark shape that had risen from the ocean still loomed before him, its form now unmistakable. It was as if the sea itself had been reshaped into a grotesque, ancient creature. Its body seemed to ripple with movements that defied logic, as though it were not of this world but rather something that existed outside of time and space. Elias's mind struggled to comprehend it, but the knowledge that this thing, whatever it was the source of the nightmare became undeniable. The rift above had grown even wider, its glow now blinding, like the sun itself had been eclipsed by a malevolent force. The air had thickened with an oppressive weight. Every breath that Elias took felt like inhaling ash. His senses were dulled, yet everything around him seemed to pulse with a terrible life. The ground beneath him was shaking, the sea was churning violently, and the wind, no longer a breeze, howled like the wails of the damned. The world was unraveling. The lighthouse, once a beacon of hope, was now a hollowed-out skeleton, its light extinguished. The thing had consumed it, much like it was consuming everything else. There was no longer any illusion of safety. The structure had become part of the living nightmare, a monument to a time long past, now corrupted. Elias's thoughts spiraled. Had it always been this way? Had this thing always been lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to emerge? A scream tore from Elias's throat, a primal sound that seemed to echo through the fabric of reality itself. But even as his voice ripped through the chaos, it was drowned out by the overwhelming noise of the storm. The ocean roared, the wind howled, and the earth groaned beneath his feet. There was no answer, no comfort, only the relentless pressure of the darkness pushing closer. He staggered forward, his mind clouded with fear and desperation. The horizon, the once distant, comforting line between the sky and the sea, was now completely obscured by the enormous rift. It was as if the very concept of a horizon had ceased to exist. There was only the endless expanse of night, pulling at his very essence, tearing away the boundaries between what was real and what was unimaginable. The world was no longer his. He was a mere speck in the face of something far older and far more powerful. As he moved toward the water, something caught his eye, something flickering at the edge of the cliffs, just beyond the reach of the crashing waves. For a moment, Elias thought it was a trick of the light, a fragment of his fading perception. But no, it was the faint outline of a figure. A person? No, it couldn't be. Everyone was gone. Everyone except him. Yet this figure seemed so real, so solid. He squinted, his breath catching in his throat as the figure grew clearer. It was a woman, her back to him, standing motionless at the cliff's edge. Her silhouette was outlined against the dark sky, her hair blowing in the wind, her hands resting at her sides. Elias's heart pounded in his chest. He recognized her. It was Sarah. But how? She had been taken, pulled into the darkness. Long ago, Elias had seen her die. He had watched the ocean take her, dragging her beneath the waves. How was she standing there, so calm, so untouched by the chaos around them? He called her name, his voice cracking in disbelief. Sarah. The woman did not turn, but the wind seemed to shift, as if in response to his voice. It was then that Elias realized something was terribly wrong. The figure before him was not Sarah. It was a shadow, a reflection of her, a trick of the mind, designed to lure him into the depths. He took a step back, the realization hitting him with full force. It wasn't Sarah. It couldn't be. This was not a reunion. This was another phase of the nightmare. He knew, deep down, that the thing beneath the waves, the ancient terror rising from the ocean, had taken Sarah's form to lure him into its grasp. She was gone. She had been consumed. The shadow of Sarah slowly turned toward him. Her eyes, now empty and hollow, met his, and Elias felt his heart freeze. The eyes were not hers. They were alien, cold, dead, and unblinking. The woman, if it could still be called that, opened her mouth, but no words emerged. Instead, a low, guttural growl, a sound that was more felt than heard, reverberated through the air. Elias's mind snapped back to reality, and he turned, stumbling away from the figure, his body moving on pure instinct. There was no time to waste. Whatever that thing was, whatever it had become, it wasn't Sarah, and it was far too dangerous to even consider. But as he ran, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The rift above, the sky opening wide, seemed to pulse with anticipation. The abyss was calling to him, and Elias was the last man standing. And that fact alone made him realize just how truly helpless he was. The last echo of humanity, the last cry for salvation, had been swallowed by the darkness long ago. Elias had long since lost the sensation of time. It was as though the passage of hours, days, or minutes had been swallowed by the ever-encroaching chaos around him. The air was thick with a strange, suffocating weight, and the once recognizable sounds of nature were replaced by an unholy silence, broken only by the occasional roar of the ocean's fury. He stumbled across the crumbling cliffs, his eyes fixed on the unholy rift in the sky above. Its presence had become so overpowering that it felt like the very fabric of reality was being torn asunder. Elias was no longer sure where the natural world ended, and a nightmare began. In the distance, the massive creature, still only a silhouette in the fog of the storm, loomed ominously, its form shifting like the dark waves themselves. Every now and then, it let out a low, almost melodic hum that seemed to reverberate deep inside Elias's bones, shaking him from the inside out. His senses had dulled, but something about this sound, the ancient hum, stirred a deep, primal fear. It was not merely the sound of a beast. It was the sound of something ancient, a force that predated humanity. The very concept of time seemed meaningless now. Everything that had once made sense was being swallowed by an all-consuming force. And then it hit him, the horrific realization. He wasn't just trapped in this nightmare. He was the last witness. There was no rescue, no way out. The rest of the world was either gone or swallowed up by the darkness long before his arrival. He had been led here, unwittingly perhaps, to play a role in something far greater and far more terrifying than he could ever understand. The lighthouse had not merely been a beacon, it was a signal. And Elias, for reasons unknown, had responded to it. He had walked into the mouth of the abyss, and now there was no turning back. For the first time since the storm began, Elias felt a strange sense of calm amidst the terror. It was as if, in that moment, the weight of responsibility had settled over him, solidifying the truth he had feared all along. There would be no savior. No one was coming to stop it. This thing that had risen from the depths was unstoppable. He was the last of something, an echo of a world long gone, the final observer before the darkness consumed everything. The wind howled around him, more violent now, tearing at his clothes and pushing him toward the edge of the cliff. Elias's legs trembled, but he remained rooted in place, unwilling to move, unable to face the truth that had been written in the very fabric of the landscape. In the distance, the strange hum grew louder, and the ground beneath him seemed to tremble in response. It was as if the rift was aware of his thoughts, aware of his fear, and was now drawing him in. The creature, if it could be called that, was not simply watching him. It was feeding on him, and it would not stop until it had consumed him completely. But there was something else. Beneath the fear and the impending doom, there was another thought creeping into his mind. Could he stop it? Could he somehow destroy the rift, destroy the thing that had summoned it? The thought was a desperate one, born from the primal need to survive. But Elias knew, deep down, that this was a battle he could not win. His mind, desperate to find hope, clung to this fleeting idea, even as the rational part of him screamed that it was futile. How could a mere man, no matter how determined, hope to combat something that existed outside of time, outside of human comprehension? But still, something compelled him to move. Not out of hope, but out of instinct. Maybe he couldn't stop it, but he could delay it. He could, at the very least, take one last step toward making the world his own. The question wasn't whether he could win. It was whether he could make the end his own. He glanced at the lighthouse, now reduced to nothing more than a rotting structure, slowly sinking into the earth. His mind screamed at him to leave, to turn around and flee, but every instinct told him that there was nothing left. There was no escape. Even the wind seemed to whisper the inevitability of this end. The lighthouse had been his first warning, but now it was the last testament to the hopelessness of his situation. Elias took a step toward the edge of the cliff, the wind now howling in his ears. His breath came in ragged gasps, and he felt his pulse thundering in his chest. His legs burned with exhaustion, but his mind was clear. In this final moment, the truth was undeniable. There would be no grand final confrontation, no epic battle between man and monster. This was not the stuff of legends. It was the quiet death of a world that had never truly been ready for what was coming. And Elias, for all his fear and disbelief, was powerless in the face of it. As he peered over the cliff, the creature's form seemed to draw closer, moving through the dark ocean, as though it were walking toward him. The hum became a chorus, reverberating through the very air, and Elias knew, with finality, that the rift was no longer a mere fracture in the sky. It was a doorway, and whatever had emerged was coming for him. For everything. There was no more time, only the endless pull of the dark tide. In the moments that followed, Elias stood frozen at the edge of the cliff, consumed by an overwhelming sensation of finality. The ground beneath him seemed to shift, as if responding to the dark presence that was now undeniably approaching. The hum that had once been distant, barely perceptible, was now unmistakable. It had filled the air around him, reverberating through his very bones, and with it came an unrelenting pressure that made it difficult to breathe. The world, once familiar and tangible, was slowly becoming something alien, a place he no longer recognized or understood. The rift in the sky had grown larger, its jagged edges stretching like a tear in the fabric of reality itself. Elias's mind raced, but it was as if his thoughts were being swallowed by the growing darkness. The very nature of his thoughts seemed at odds with the overwhelming presence of the rift. What was once the world he knew now seemed so small, so fragile in the face of something so vast and incomprehensible. He had believed for a moment that perhaps he could turn back, that there might still be a way to escape. But now, as the wind howled louder and the creature neared, he realized that such thoughts were futile. Escape was no longer an option. It was in this moment of utter despair that the truth became undeniable. The rift was not merely a rupture in the sky. It was a doorway, a portal that beckoned something far older and more powerful than anything Elias could fathom. The creature, whose form had been indistinct and vague in the fog, was now unmistakable. It was a silhouette so vast that it seemed to consume the horizon itself. The creature's presence was not just a physical manifestation. It was an experience, something that resonated deep within the very fabric of reality, and Elias could feel it pulling at him, testing the limits of his sanity. The waves crashed violently below, as though the ocean itself was being stirred by the creature's awakening. Elias stepped back from the edge, his heart pounding in his chest. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to flee from this ancient terror. But where could he go? The cliffs surrounding the lighthouse were a jagged labyrinth, leading only to the depths of the sea or to the very rift that was opening above him. The realization was as cold as it was final. The world he knew was no longer the world at all. It had been overtaken by something else, something that had been waiting for this very moment. The hum from the rift was growing louder, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to echo through time itself. It was not the sound of any creature Elias could recognize, but of something far older, something that predated human understanding. The air had thickened, becoming oppressive, almost suffocating, and Elias felt the weight of it pressing in on him. His mind began to unravel, grasping at fleeting thoughts that were slipping away faster than he could hold on to them. It was as though the very nature of his existence was being erased, replaced by something far more terrifying, far more enduring. For a brief moment, Elias was struck by the absurdity of it all. He had come here, to this forsaken lighthouse, seeking answers, seeking truth. But now he realized that the answers he had so desperately sought were irrelevant. The truth was far more terrifying than he could have ever imagined. This was not the end of a chapter in a story. This was the end of everything. There was no salvation, no hero to rise up and face the dark. There was only the void and the creature that emerged from it. His legs trembled, but he forced himself to move, drawn to the lighthouse as though it held some kind of answer, some kind of final truth. Perhaps it was the last thing left standing in a world that was slowly unraveling. Perhaps it was the last bastion of hope before the final collapse. He stumbled towards it, the wind biting at his skin, the hum now a deafening roar in his ears. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the very act of moving was an exertion of will against the pull of the rift itself. As he approached the lighthouse, Elias felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The structure, once a symbol of guidance and safety, now felt like a prison, a tomb where the last remnants of humanity would be buried. The rift in the sky had swallowed everything. The towns, the people, the very essence of life itself. And now, the creature that had emerged was coming for the last piece of the world that had once been his. Elias could feel the air thickening with every passing second, as though the rift itself was reaching down to claim him. The hum grew louder, impossibly so, and Elias thought he could hear voices within it, distant and distorted, whispering of things he could not comprehend. He pressed his hands to his ears, but it did nothing to block the sound. The lighthouse loomed before him, its twisted form now a silhouette against the growing darkness. He reached for the door, but it was locked, as though the structure itself was resisting him. It didn't matter. He had reached the point of no return. There was no escaping the rift, no evading the creature that lurked beyond it. The only thing left was to face it head-on, whatever it was, and accept that whatever happened next would be the end of the world as he knew it. Elias turned to face the rift one last time, watching as the creature, its form now more defined, slithered through the air toward him. It was no longer a mere shape in the distance. It was here. The dark tide had come, and there was no one left to stop it. The door to the rift was open. As the creature drew closer, the reality that Elias had once known seemed to disintegrate. It was as though the very air around him was warping under its presence, bending to its will, and Elias was left standing in a world where nothing was certain. The lighthouse, which had once stood as a beacon of safety against the stormy seas, now felt like a relic, a monument to a time that no longer had any meaning. He had always imagined that the purpose of a lighthouse was to guide the lost, to provide a glimmer of hope in the darkest hours. But now, with the creature looming over him and the rift pulling everything into its maw, the lighthouse seemed more like a tombstone, marking the end of what could have been. He could feel the pull of the rift deep within him, a cold, crushing force that sought to drag him toward it. He tried to resist, but it was as though his very essence was being drawn into its grasp, unraveling the fibers of his being. The hum that emanated from the rift was not just a sound. It was a physical presence, an entity in itself that seemed to reverberate through his skin and bones. Each note of that hum felt like a step further away from his humanity, each moment in its presence stripping him of the things that made him who he was. He was no longer merely a man standing at the edge of a cliff, looking at the vastness of the ocean. He was part of something far larger, far older, and far more terrifying. The creature had now fully emerged from the rift. Its massive form rippled through the air with a terrifying grace, its edges bleeding into the fabric of reality itself. Elias could barely make out its features, not because of the darkness that had overtaken the sky, but because his mind could not comprehend what he was seeing. It wasn't simply a creature. It was a force of nature, an entity whose very existence defied logic and reason. Its body seemed to shift and change, flowing like liquid in one moment and solid like stone in the next. Its shape was ever-changing, as though it was not bound by the laws of physics or time. Elias knew that it was not just a physical being. It was an idea, a concept that had taken form in the rift. As the creature moved closer, Elias's senses began to fragment. He could hear his own breath, shallow and erratic, but it was distant, as though it was coming from someone else. The ground beneath him trembled, and he could feel the vibration seeping into his very soul. The sea, which had been so distant and indifferent earlier, now seemed to respond to the creature's approach. The waves were no longer simply crashing against the rocks. They were churning with an unnatural fury, as though they too were being pulled into the creature's orbit. The wind howled, but it was not the wind Elias had known. It was the sound of something ancient, a sound that carried with it the weight of millennia. Elias stumbled backward, his mind racing for a way out, but there was no escape. The cliffs were sheer, the sea a vast and unyielding expanse of dark water. The lighthouse, once a symbol of guidance, now felt like a prison. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The creature was everywhere and nowhere at the same time. It was as though the very landscape had been swallowed by it, twisted into something unrecognizable. He turned, desperate to find refuge in the lighthouse, but the door remained locked, an impenetrable barrier to the last place that could offer him any shred of safety. In that moment, Elias realized the true nature of the creature. It was not merely an invader from another realm. It was a harbinger, a being that existed beyond the boundaries of time and space, and it had come to claim this world as its own. The rift, the hum, the creature itself, it was all part of the same process. The creature was not just a force of destruction. It was the embodiment of entropy, the inevitable collapse of order into chaos. The world as Elias had known it was already breaking apart. There was no salvation, no hero who would rise to face the darkness. There was only the end, and the creature was its instrument. Elias's body trembled, his mind struggling to grasp the enormity of what was happening. The air around him seemed to grow colder, thicker, as though the very atmosphere was being drained of life. He reached out, his fingers brushing the cold stone of the lighthouse, desperate to hold on to something, anything that might keep him grounded in the face of the overwhelming abyss. But there was nothing. The lighthouse was just another relic, another broken promise in a world that no longer had room for hope. As the creature advanced, Elias felt an overwhelming compulsion to look into its eyes, to meet the gaze of this thing that had come from the rift. And so, despite every instinct telling him to run, he did. He lifted his head, staring into the creature's shifting form. The instant their gazes met, the world seemed to stop. Time itself seemed to freeze, and Elias was no longer standing on the cliff, no longer caught between the rift and the abyss. He was standing inside it, trapped in a place where the very concept of space and time had ceased to exist. The creature's eyes, or what Elias thought might have been eyes, shifted and swirled, impossibly vast, yet infinitely deep. They were not simply eyes. They were a window into the infinite, a gaze that reached through him, through everything he had ever known and beyond. In that moment, Elias understood that the creature was not a physical being at all. It was the manifestation of the rift, a being born from the collapse of worlds and the unraveling of reality itself. The creature was not invading the world. It was the world, the end of one world, and the beginning of something far darker. Elias felt his mind unraveling as the creature's gaze held him, and for the first time in his life, he realized that he was no longer in control. The world around him no longer made sense, and the sensation of falling became an all-encompassing truth. There was no escape from the rift. There was no escape from the creature. There was only the descent into the unknown, into a place where nothing could survive, where even the concept of life would be swallowed by the dark tide. And in that moment, Elias understood that his fate had never been his own. It had always been tied to the creature, to the rift. He had only been a witness to a story that had already been written, and now that story was ending. Elias's mind, once full of thoughts and emotions, began to dissolve like mist under the weight of the creature's presence. He had always believed that human perception was a fixed thing, that the world around them was a concrete reality anchored in time and space. But the creature's gaze shattered that belief with a singularity of purpose. It was not simply observing him. It was dissecting him layer by layer, exposing the fragile threads that held his consciousness together. Time itself seemed to stutter, caught between worlds that no longer existed. Elias's grasp on reality was slipping away, and he was powerless to hold it together. The world around him folded in on itself. The lighthouse, which had been his last bastion of stability, now appeared like a decayed artifact of some forgotten era. Its stone walls were cracked, as though the very foundation was crumbling under the weight of something much larger. The ground beneath him quivered, a deep, resonant hum reverberating through the earth. Every step Elias had taken was now lost to him, as though his feet had never touched the surface. His body, heavy with terror, felt disconnected, suspended in a void where gravity had no dominion. And yet, in the emptiness, there was an undeniable sense of falling, of being pulled into something vast and unknowable. The creature was everywhere now, its presence stretching beyond the limits of his perception. It was no longer simply in front of him, but around him, within him, filling every corner of his mind. Its form continued to shift and morph, like 1,000 whispered nightmares converging into one. Each time Elias tried to focus on its shape, it slipped further away, becoming less a thing and more an idea, a concept beyond comprehension. His body felt like a mere illusion, as though it too could dissipate at any moment, merging with the rift that had now overtaken everything. It was then that Elias felt the pull intensify. His body, once heavy with fear, now felt impossibly light, as though the air had become a vacuum, siphoning away everything that made him real. The rift had a hunger, a thirst for something beyond the tangible, beyond what could be understood. And Elias, in this moment, realized with a clarity that chilled him to the core that he was not merely witnessing the collapse of his reality. He was part of it. His very existence was tethered to the creature, to the rift. The boundary between him and the abyss had become porous, and now he was slipping through, caught between two worlds, neither of which would claim him. The creature's voice, if it could even be called that, echoed in his mind. It was not a voice as he knew it, but rather a presence, a pressure that communicated through feelings, through impressions. He could feel its thoughts, a maddening series of images and sensations that raced through his consciousness. The rift was not just a tear in space. It was a force of annihilation, a dissolution of all that was known. It sought to return everything to its most primal state, to erase the distinctions between matter and nothingness. Elias, in that instant, realized that his world had not been destroyed. It was being unmade, piece by piece, by the will of the rift, by the hunger of the creature that fed on the fabric of reality itself. The darkness around him deepened, suffocating, as the rift continued to unravel time and space. He could no longer tell if his body was still bound to the world he had once known. The sensation of weightlessness intensified, and the winds howled with a fury that tore at his senses. His own thoughts were becoming fragmented, each one disconnected from the next. His memories, once so vivid, now felt like distant echoes, fading with every passing second. The creature's influence was not just physical, it was mental, spiritual. Elias was being unraveled, stripped of everything that made him whole, leaving him adrift in an ocean of void. But amidst the terror, there was a strange clarity that pierced through the chaos. The creature's power was not simply destructive, it was transformative. It did not seek to kill Elias, not in the traditional sense. It sought to erase him entirely, to turn him into nothing more than a fragment of an idea. And in that erasure, he would become part of something much larger. There was no escape, no hope of survival. There was only the slow, inevitable dissolution of his existence, the unraveling of a life that had once been. Elias's mind raced, trying to grasp at some fragment of resistance, some thread of hope, but there was none. The rift had already claimed him, and now it was dragging him into the depths. His body, once so aware of itself, was becoming an afterthought. The walls of the lighthouse were no longer visible, swallowed up by the expanding void. The sea, the cliffs, the sky, everything had been consumed by the creature's presence. There was nothing left but the sensation of falling, of being pulled deeper into the abyss, where there would be no return. As the world around him dissolved into nothingness, Elias felt the final threads of his consciousness slipping away. The creature's influence was absolute, and in the face of it, he was nothing, less than nothing. And yet, there was a strange comfort in that realization. He had never truly understood the fragility of his existence until now. In the end, he had been nothing more than a fleeting moment in the vastness of time, a whisper in the void. And now, as the last remnants of his awareness faded, Elias embraced the darkness. For in the end, the rift would consume all. And in that consumption, there would be no more pain, no more fear, only the silence that followed. With a final, breathless sigh, Elias vanished into the rift, swallowed whole by the thing that had come to end the world. And in his disappearance, the creature, the rift, and all that was gone, leaving behind only the lighthouse, now empty and abandoned, standing at the edge of the cliff, watching over the eternal sea. The light of the lighthouse had flickered for the last time. Its beam, once a steady beacon of warning for the ships that dared approach the jagged cliffs, had sputtered out into the darkness, consumed by the very thing it had sought to guard against. In the stillness that followed, the world felt hollow. The wind, which had previously carried whispers of an oncoming storm, now passed like a dry breath, empty and devoid of purpose. The sea, too, had fallen silent. No longer did it crash against the rocks in its relentless dance. It lay still, as though holding its breath, waiting for something that would never come. It was in this silence that the echoes of Elias's disappearance seemed to reverberate. He had been swallowed whole by the rift, lost to the world in an instant. The creature's presence, once overwhelming, had faded into the fabric of the unknown, leaving no trace of its existence behind. And yet, for all its absence, the air seemed to hum with a strange, oppressive energy, as though something lingered just beyond the edge of perception. Something was still there, watching, waiting. The lighthouse stood, unmoving, a silent sentinel over the cliff, its purpose now lost to the winds of time. But there was one who had not forgotten, one who had seen everything, and yet remained untouched by the rift's pull. His name was Matthias, a man of few words, but whose presence had always felt like a constant in a world that was anything but. He had been the keeper of the lighthouse long before Elias had arrived, long before the rift had made its claim on the world, and now he was its last witness. Matthias had felt the tremors long before the light went out. He had sensed the disturbance in the air, the way the earth seemed to shift beneath his feet, as though the very ground was trying to escape the chaos that was unfolding above. The lighthouse had been built to withstand storms, to guide the lost through the darkest of nights, but nothing had prepared Matthias for what was coming. No storm, no wave, no shipwreck had ever brought such a feeling of dread as the one that was now approaching. And yet, despite the overwhelming sense of inevitability, Matthias had stayed. There had been no choice but to stay. For Matthias, the lighthouse was more than just a building. It was a prison, one he had willingly entered all those years ago. He had been called to it, drawn by a force he could not explain. It was as if the lighthouse itself had chosen him, or perhaps he had chosen it. Either way, he had become its keeper, its guardian, and in return, it had kept him safe from the world outside. But now, as he stood at the threshold of the lightless tower, Matthias could feel the prison's walls closing in on him. The creature that had taken Elias was not a force of nature. It was a curse, a sickness that had been born in the darkness of the world. And now it was coming from Matthias. The thought should have terrified him. It should have sent him fleeing into the hills, to the safety of the town below. But Matthias felt no fear. Instead, he felt a strange sense of resignation, as if he had been waiting for this moment his entire life. Perhaps he had always known this would be the end. The world was changing, crumbling beneath the weight of something far older than humanity. The creature that had taken Elias was just the beginning. Matthias understood that now. The rift was not just a tear in space. It was a door, one that had opened, and now the flood of darkness would pour through, consuming everything in its path. As he walked through the now deserted lighthouse, Matthias could hear the creak of the floorboards beneath his feet. The building had aged, just as he had, its once sturdy walls now sagging under the pressure of time. But still it stood, and Matthias, despite everything, could not help but feel a strange affection for the place. It had been his home, his anchor in a world that had long since lost its way. And yet, the time had come for it to fall, just as everything else had fallen. The door to the lantern room was locked, but Matthias had the key. He had always had the key. He had unlocked it many times before, in the quiet hours of the night, when the sea was calm and the world seemed at peace. But this time was different. This time, the room felt wrong. The air inside was thick with a kind of heaviness that made it difficult to breathe. As Matthias stepped inside, he could feel the presence of something unseen, something that was not supposed to be there. The lantern, once a proud beacon of light, stood dim and lifeless in the center of the room, its glass shattered, its flame extinguished. And there, in the shadows, something stirred. Matthias's heart raced as the shape in the shadows began to take form. It was not the creature that had taken Elias, but something else, something older, something that had been waiting, perhaps for centuries. The darkness was alive, and it was watching him. Matthias felt a chill run down his spine, but he did not turn away. He knew what he had to do. He had never been one to back down from a task, and this was no different. He had been the keeper of the lighthouse for as long as he could remember, and he would not leave it now, not when the world was on the brink of unraveling. The creature had come to claim Elias, but Matthias would not let it claim him. He would stand his ground, even if it meant facing the darkness alone. As the shadows closed in, Matthias's thoughts turned to Elias. He had seen the man, brave, determined, yet unaware of the true nature of the threat that lay before them. Elias had tried to fight it, tried to understand it, but in the end it had consumed him. And now Matthias would stand in his place, a last line of defense against a force that could not be understood but could certainly be felt. In the silence that followed, Matthias took a step forward, and the darkness seemed to retreat, if only for a moment. The world outside, the lighthouse, the sea, everything was waiting for the inevitable. But Matthias was ready. He had always been ready. And as the first tendrils of the rift began to stretch out from the shadows, Matthias stood firm, ready to face whatever came next. The wake of Elias's disappearance had not come for him yet, but Matthias knew it would. The question now was not if, but when. Matthias had stood at the precipice of the lighthouse for what felt like hours, gazing into the impenetrable darkness that stretched endlessly beyond the cliffs. The sea, once a great source of solace for him, now seemed like a vast, unknowable force, its waves rising and falling in a rhythm that no longer brought peace. It was as though the ocean itself had lost its memory, its purpose replaced by a void that echoed only silence. The world had become disjointed, as if some unseen hand had rearranged the very fabric of reality. What had once been certain, safety, routine, the simple act of guiding ships through treacherous waters, had been replaced by an abyss that was both mental and physical. Inside the lighthouse, the creature that had swallowed Elias was no longer a whisper on the edge of his thoughts. It was a presence, solid and consuming, that now sat at the heart of Matthias's every movement. The shadows were thick, dense, and alive. Matthias could no longer tell if they were the product of his mind, his growing sense of isolation, or if they were something far more tangible, something that had crawled out from the darkened corners of the earth. Yet, despite the creeping dread that seemed to have embedded itself deep within him, Matthias was resolute. He had made his decision. There was no turning back. When he entered the lantern room that night, he did so with purpose. The shattered remnants of the old light lay scattered about, the lens cracked, the intricate mechanism useless. The flickering light that had once guided countless ships safely to shore was now a memory, a forgotten relic in a crumbling world. But Matthias didn't need the lantern to see. There was something else now, something beyond sight. The air itself had thickened, not with fog or mist, but with a strange, acrid energy that vibrated against his chest. He felt it in his bones. What had once been a simple tool to ward off storms was now a prison. His own sense of time had unraveled in the hours following Elias's disappearance. The sun and moon had become irrelevant. It no longer mattered whether the day had turned to night. What mattered was the presence that lingered, something that had crossed over from another realm and was now slowly encroaching on his reality. His instincts screamed at him to leave, to escape before it was too late. But Matthias had long since abandoned the luxury of fear. If this was the end, then so be it. As Matthias stood in the lantern room, his eyes adjusted to the oppressive darkness that filled the space. And that was when he saw them. Two eyes, vast, unfathomable, and full of knowing, gazed at him from the corner. They were not eyes in any traditional sense. They didn't belong to a creature or a being that could be identified. They were deeper, older, like the eyes of the universe itself, staring back at him with an unyielding, judgmental gaze. The moment their gaze met his, something within Matthias broke. A rush of memories, sensations, and emotions, none of them his own, flooded his mind. It was as though these eyes had seen every moment of his existence, had measured him, weighed him, and found him wanting. In that instant, Matthias understood that these were not mere eyes. They were the eyes of the rift, the eyes of the entity that had lived in the shadowed spaces between dimensions. The creature that had swallowed Elias was only a fraction of what was truly waiting, a mere extension of something older, something that had been waiting long before the lighthouse had been built. The rift was not just a tear in space. It was a portal, an invitation, a gateway for something that could not be fully comprehended by human minds. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Matthias's heart raced. There was no longer any escape, no way to outrun what was coming. He had stood at the edge of this abyss for so long, hoping to turn back the tide, to keep the darkness at bay, but now he could feel its pull. It was inevitable. There was no resisting it. The eyes blinked once, slowly, and Matthias felt a wave of nausea wash over him. It was as if the universe itself had just shifted, and his place in it had become uncertain. In that moment, he felt utterly small. He was no longer a keeper of the lighthouse, no longer a guardian of any place. He was a speck, a fleeting thought in a vast, indifferent cosmos. But he did not turn away. He could not. The eyes were unblinking now, unyielding, and their gaze seemed to reach deeper than Matthias could bear. He saw flashes, memories that weren't his own, fleeting images of people, figures that flickered in and out of focus, trapped between spaces, suspended in the void. Some were faces he recognized, others were strangers, horrible, grotesque in their unfamiliarity, but all linked by one terrifying truth. They had all gazed into these eyes, and like Elias, they had disappeared into the dark, never to return. And then, just as quickly as the vision had come, it was gone. The eyes were still there, fixed on him, but the overwhelming flood of thoughts receded. Matthias was left alone in the darkness, once more, the weight of the encounter pressing down on him. He stood motionless, barely able to process the enormity of what had just occurred. He had been marked. There was no going back from this. Whatever it was that had set its eyes upon him would come for him, just as it had come for Elias. Outside, the wind had picked up again, howling in fury against the cliffs. The rift, however, remained still. There was no crash of waves, no tremor of the earth. It was as though the world had paused in anticipation. Matthias turned away from the corner, his mind swimming with the impossible. He had seen what was coming, and yet he felt utterly powerless against it. He had come to the lighthouse seeking solitude, to escape the burdens of the world. But now, the very walls that had once offered sanctuary seemed to close in around him, trapping him in a cage of his own making. Matthias had always thought the lighthouse was a place of light, a symbol of guidance. But now he knew better. It was not a beacon for those lost in the dark. It was a prison, and he had been its warden for far too long. As Matthias stepped away from the lantern room, his footsteps heavy and deliberate, he realized that there was no escape from the rift. There had never been. There was only the slow, inevitable descent into darkness. The eyes would follow him, no matter where he went, and no matter how hard he fought against it, the void would take him, just as it had taken Elias. Matthias had long since accepted that the lighthouse was no longer his sanctuary. The walls, which had once offered a sense of duty, had now become a suffocating presence, reminding him that he was not the master here, but merely a visitor. The winds howled more fiercely now, whipping against the stone exterior, carrying with them whispers that seemed to echo through the dark corners of his mind. There was no longer any pretense of safety. The very air he breathed was thick with the weight of impending doom. The abyss that had once seemed distant had come closer, as if drawn in by an invisible force. And Matthias could feel it, its pull, its hunger. He had tried to remain calm, to rationalize what he had seen in the lantern room. The eyes, those unfathomable depths that had pierced his very soul, had left him shaken but strangely resolute. The creature that had swallowed Elias was no longer a mere specter. It had woven itself into the fabric of his thoughts, transforming from a singular event into a constant presence. The rift, he now understood, was not just a tear in reality, it was an invitation, and Matthias had unwittingly answered it. Yet, in the aftermath of the encounter, there was no grand revelation, no sudden burst of clarity. The world did not shift. The ground did not tremble. The lighthouse still stood, its towering silhouette cutting through the darkness. But the very nature of what Matthias had known had changed. It was as if the world was now seen through a different lens, distorted, uncertain, and terrifyingly unknown. And it was in this altered reality that Matthias found himself standing once again on the edge of the cliffs, looking down at the ocean below. The waves crashed against the rocks with a rhythmic force that seemed almost deliberate, as if the sea was alive, waiting, watching. Matthias could feel it, an energy in the air, an electric charge that hummed beneath his skin. The darkness was not just a passive presence. It was active, aware, and it had found him. The abyss was not content to remain at the edges of the world. It had its sights set on him now, and it was drawing him in. As he stared into the churning depths below, Matthias's thoughts turned to Elias. He had heard the stories, of course, the whispers that circulated among the lighthouse keepers. Elias had gone mad. They said, driven to insanity by the darkness in the rift. They spoke of strange lights, of voices carried on the wind, and of a growing hunger that consumed all who ventured too close. But Matthias had never believed in the superstitions. He had always thought of himself as practical, grounded in the reality of his work. But now, as he stood there, he realized that the reality he had known was a fragile illusion. The rift had not been merely a tear in the world. It was a gateway, a door to something far older and more malevolent than he could have ever imagined. Matthias had felt its presence before. The subtle shifts in the air, the disorienting sense of time slipping away, the whispering voices that seemed to beckon from the shadows. But now, as he stood on the precipice of the cliff, he could feel its call more clearly than ever before. It was not a call of hunger or thirst, as one might expect from a predator. No, this call was different. It was an invitation to join the abyss, to become part of something greater than himself. There was a strange allure to it, a pull that seemed to reach into the very depths of his soul. It promised an end to the pain, a release from the isolation that had plagued him for so long. The abyss was not just an enemy. It was a part of him now, a part that had been awakened by the rift. And yet, as Matthias stood there, caught between the call of the abyss and the desire to resist, he realized something even more terrifying. He no longer had the power to resist. The rift had already claimed him. He had been marked the moment he set foot in the lighthouse, the moment he had gazed into the eyes that watched from the corner. He had thought he could fight it, that he could protect himself. But the truth was that the darkness had already woven itself into the very fabric of his being. The waves below continued to crash against the rocks, each one more deafening than the last. The sea was a vast, unknowable force, but it was no longer the enemy. It was merely the vehicle, the messenger. The true enemy was the darkness, the force that lay beyond the veil, and it was coming for him. In the days that followed, Matthias could no longer discern between waking and dreaming. The voices that had once been distant whispers now filled his mind, growing louder with each passing moment. They spoke of the abyss, of the things that waited there, of the fate that awaited him. They told him that he was not alone, that he had never been alone. The abyss had always been with him, lurking just beneath the surface of his consciousness. It had merely been waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And now, that moment had come. Matthias knew he could no longer fight. There was no longer any point in resistance. The abyss had claimed him, body and soul. As the waves crashed against the rocks below, he felt a strange sense of peace. The darkness that had once terrified him now seemed like a comforting embrace. It was as though the weight of his existence, the burden of his choices, had been lifted. The abyss was not a place to be feared. It was a place to be embraced. With a final glance at the lighthouse, At the crumbling walls that had once offered him purpose, Matthias stepped forward, letting the call of the abyss guide him. The wind howled around him, but it was no longer a threat. It was a song, a lullaby, singing him into the dark. The world was fading away, and Matthias was no longer afraid. He had become part of something greater, something eternal. And as he fell, disappearing into the vast, churning sea below, he realized that this was not an end. It was a beginning. The lighthouse stood silent now, an ancient sentinel against the storm that raged beyond its walls. The wind howled, cutting through the cracks in the stone, but there was no one left to heed its warning. The keeper was gone, vanished into the abyss that had come to claim him. It was as if the world itself had forgotten Matthias ever existed, as if the very earth had swallowed his story whole. The lighthouse had always been a beacon of hope, of light, of guidance. But now, it had become something else. It was a monument to loss, a symbol of the darkness that had begun to seep into the world. From a distance, it looked as though nothing had changed. The sea still crashed against the cliffs, its rhythm unbroken. The stars still flickered in the sky, though now they seemed distant cold. But for those who knew the truth, for those who had felt the pull of the abyss, everything had changed. The rift had widened, its reach growing ever larger, more insidious. What had once been a tear in reality was now a chasm, an inescapable void that could no longer be ignored. It was as though the fabric of existence itself had been torn asunder, and now there was no way to repair it. Matthias had been right to believe that the abyss was not simply an enemy. It was a force that had always existed, lurking just beyond the edge of perception, waiting for the right moment to emerge. And in that moment, when the lighthouse keeper had stepped over the edge, it had claimed him. But in doing so, it had also claimed something more. It had claimed the world itself. The abyss was no longer just a place. It had become an inevitability. The darkness had spread, its tendrils reaching into the hearts of those who had once stood in defiance of it. In the months that followed, the town by the cliffs became a place of strange occurrences. The once bustling harbor, which had been filled with the sounds of ships and sailors, became eerily silent. The locals spoke in hushed tones, their eyes always darting to the sea, as if the water itself held secrets they were afraid to uncover. The lighthouse, once a symbol of safety, had become a place of dread. No one dared approach it now. It stood as a warning, a testament to the darkness that lay beyond the edges of the world. Some said that Matthias had been the last to succumb to the abyss, but others whispered of new disappearances, of people who had ventured too close to the cliffs and never returned. The children who had once played near the shore now stayed far from the water, their imaginations filled with tales of the creature that lurked beneath the surface. But it was not just the children who feared the sea. The adults, too, had begun to speak in nervous riddles. They had seen the lights at night, the strange flickers that danced across the waves. They had heard the voices, soft and insistent, calling to them from the depths. And they knew, deep down, that the abyss was not finished with them yet. The town had become a place suspended between two realities, where the past and future were no longer distinct. People moved through their days as if in a trance, their lives governed by a sense of inevitability. The abyss had already consumed Matthias, and it was not content to stop there. It had taken root in the minds of the townspeople, weaving itself into their thoughts and dreams. The darkness had become part of them, as though it were always meant to be. And in the silence that followed, the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would come next. In the dead of night, the lighthouse still burned, its light cutting through the storm like a beacon. But now, its purpose was unclear. No longer a guide, it stood as a monument to something far darker. The light that had once promised safety now only illuminated the growing shadow, casting long, eerie shapes across the cliffs. The sea, too, seemed changed. It was no longer a mere body of water. It had become something else entirely, something alive. It whispered in the wind, calling out to those who were brave, or foolish enough to listen. But Matthias was no longer there to hear it. The keeper had been taken, his fate sealed the moment he had looked into the eyes that watched from the rift. He had not understood then what he was being asked to join, but he did now. He had become part of the abyss, part of the eternal darkness that had always been there, lurking just out of sight. And in doing so, he had unlocked something within himself, a truth that transcended life and death, time and space. The abyss was not just an external force. It was a part of every person, of every place. It was the darkness within, the quiet despair that went unnoticed until it was too late. And now Matthias had become its ambassador, its representative in the world of the living. The abyss had claimed him, and through him, it had claimed everything else. The lighthouse was its final victory, a beacon not of hope, but of inevitability. As the wind howled through the cliffs, as the waves crashed violently against the shore, there was no longer any distinction between the light and the dark. They had become one, inseparable. The abyss had enveloped the world, and in its cold embrace, there was no escape, no salvation, only the quiet, persistent pull toward the unknown. Matthias had answered the call, and now, in his absence, it was clear. The abyss would never let go. The lighthouse still stood, but its light no longer offered guidance. Instead, it served as a reminder of the darkness that had always existed, of the force that had claimed everything, and of the inevitable end that awaited all who came too close. The abyss was not finished with the world. It was only just beginning, and there, in the distance, the faintest glow from the lighthouse flickered, as though waiting for the next soul to answer its call.